Hey everyone. I want to start by thanking GOMA for having me here to allow us to come to this marvelous, I shouldn't say marvelous. Got 2 seconds in before I said marvelous. Magnificent exhibit in this wonderful space and in this amazing city, in this wonderful country where the people are so very, very warm and the beer is so very, very cold. I love both those things. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Chris, for having me. Let's start. At the very beginning, it's a very good place to start with first principles. Superheroes are not subtle. In their defense, they're not supposed to be. That's not what they're engineered to do. That's not what they exist to be. What they exist to be is our noblest ideas of who we are, distilled to their essence, and then injected into a body with 2% body fat and wrapped in spandex. That's exactly what they are. Now, why that distillation? Why are we taking these concepts and reducing them? Because of something that a lot of nerds won't admit, and if you press them, you might be able to get them to admit, but they will disavow it. But I'm here to tell you that superheroes are children's stories. They always have been, they always will be. They exist to take the very complicated world with its shades of gray, its complexity, its confusing nature, and reduce it to the starkest possible terms. There is good, there is evil, and if you're very, very good and eat your vegetables, good will triumph over evil. That is comforting. Even the dimmest kid can pick up on that. They exist to inform us that more than just there's good and evil, also, because any kid who has been kicked to the ground in the playground knows something else. There is good, there is evil, there is injustice. Life isn't fair. The strong prey on the weak, the rich on the poor, the powerful on the powerless. So what is required of us is to stand up and challenge injustice. That's what they show us how to do. They are life lessons. They are meant to inspire. Now, people say they're wish fulfillment. You'll hear superheroes often dismissed as wish fulfillment, and that's true. But it's a special kind of wish. It's not just, I wish I could fly. I wish I was invulnerable. I wish I could take my shirt off at the pool. They exist to do more than this. They are, as I say, our noblest selves. The person that we wish we could be in their situation, which is a very highly specific situation, I grant you, but we wish to see in ourselves people who would stand up for somebody else, for people who can't or won't stand up for themselves. That's what they are, our noblest self. Or at least they were until 1961, when Marvel came along and screwed that all up. Because they created a roster of heroes who were vain, arrogant, weirdly combative. Like they all exist within about 6 square blocks of Manhattan, and if they ever see each other on a rooftop, they start fighting. They're like Siamese fighting fish in costumes. So these noble ideas get reduced to vain, petty, megalomaniac, angry, weirdly combative jerks, basically. They become us, in other words. This was one of the first adventures of Spider-Man, and it ends with the words, more fascinating details about the life and adventures of the world's most amazing teenager, Spider-Man, the superhero who could be you. And I would argue he is us. That's what he's for. But that changed everything. And to understand why it did, and why we're here today talking about these characters, and why the global box office looks like it does right now, you have to understand what came before. So if there are any Marvel executives in the room, you might want to politely turn away, because we're going to be, for a couple slides, because we're going to be talking about what came before. Because you have to understand the sea change that these characters represented. So, and it's also, you know what, history is inconvenient, and it's just true that the other guys got there first. Created the concept of the superhero, which for far too long has meant white guy with powers in a circus strongman outfit. It still, in many circles, remains that. But this was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in 1938. And it exists to, it came along and it was so successful. It took them a while to figure out how successful it was. It took them about 6 to 8 months to figure it out. It was so successful that their publishers started ripping them off immediately, churning out dozens and dozens of dudes in circus tights fighting crime. In the run-up to America's entry into World War II, and during that war, the comic book shelves were filled with very similar cops in capes, basically. Everybody got into the act, not just DC, not just the National Periodical Publications, it was called then, but it's called DC now. Everybody got into the act, and I mean everybody. Now, I said before that superheroes are not subtle. Visual iconography is 50% of the game with comics, but on a comic book cover, it's 100% of the game. And what do you have here? You have an American flag that's come to life to punch a Nazi. Not subtle. But these superheroes, this era of the superhero, only lasted until the close of World War II. Then the vogue for superheroes faded. Only a few superheroes actually made it all the way to 1950. Most of their titles closed, shuttered. And as I say, only a handful survived. But what happened is that they got replaced by romance comics and war comics and detective comics and Western comics. The vogue for the superhero was over. So those who did hung on not by representing America as they had during the war, but by representing a weird, very bougie idea of the American way. So settling down, having a weenie roast in the backyard, they represent the establishment. They represent the status quo. That's what they existed to do. And they did that very well, relatively successfully, but only a few, as I say, held on. About 10 years after the end of World War II and the end of the first superhero kind of wave, DC reintroduced a lot of their old heroes, kept the names, but completely changed the characters. Completely changed who they are, what their powers were, updated them for the space age, basically, for the jet age, giving them a science fiction spin. And it proved relatively successful, successful enough for them to have a team book. But what DC didn't realize is that in those 10 years when the superheroes went away, something had changed. It wasn't something you would notice unless you were looking for it. And the reason we're here today, the reason that exhibit is the exhibit it is because somebody noticed. This is a guy by the name of Stanley Martin Lieber in 1955. He's a business guy, right? Suit and tie guy. He wants to write the great American novel. He wants to be a playwright, went to college to study playwriting. But he got a job at a comics publisher. It's not really his dream job, but he's churning out romance comics and war comics and Western comics and whatever these are. The Blip, Sprag, Moomba is here, Rambu, Van Doom. He didn't want to put the name Stanley Martin Lieber to Moomba is here, so he chose the name Stan Lee. Just rolled off the tongue easier, so he could still go on writing his novels and plays. Didn't really do it, but that was the idea. Remember, he's a business guy first and foremost. He is an editor, and when you're an editor, your job is 50% writing and 50% marketing. You're trying to identify what's changing, what your readers, in this case, want, so you can serve it up to them. So you continue to ruthlessly market to them. And if you don't believe Stan Lee is a ruthless marketer and aware of trends, consider this is what he looked like a few years later. Now, that lapel, let's talk about that lapel for a second. A good stiff wind, and that guy's airborne. It's like the flying nun. So again, keeping up on trends and noticing something. What he noticed was that in the 1940s and 50s, his main audience looked a lot like this. But with the turn of 1960, all of a sudden, his audience was starting to look a lot more like this. These were people who did not treat comics as playthings, like the toys of their youth, like hula hoops, that stuff that they would put away when they turned 11 or 12 and discovered girls. They'd hold onto them, because to these people, It wasn't just a diversion, a novelty, it was a habit. Comics was, for lack of a better word, a lifestyle, something they loved and they kept loving through adolescence and puberty. So to reach these people who are reading more comics now, you need to make different kinds of comics. Emotionalism had always been a part of superhero comics. Big, huge, overwrought emotions. That's what they trafficked on. Not the hero. Hero didn't have emotions, he was a hero. Everybody around him had emotions. They could afford it. He had to be just a big, blank ball of cheese in the middle, and everybody around him could react. That was the formula. It was a very, very simple formula. A lot of choke sobs in the comics of the 1950s. Lots of big anger, big jealousy, big rage. Because there was a formula, a very ruthlessly simple formula. Perfect and powerful. You have the guy in the center of the circus who has a lot of power, and he is physically perfect. He is mentally perfect. Other people around him are flawed and human. It will not surprise you to learn that the concept of the superhero, the essential concept of what a superhero is, has always carried more than a faint whiff of fascism. Why is that? Physical perfection, strong visual iconography, characters who are serving what they call the greater good, but they are enforcing their will because they happen to be powerful, or they're rich and they have many gadgets. Might making right. It's always been there, sort of vibrating just underneath the surface. So what these guys did, that is Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in happier times, and that is Steve Ditko over there. What they decided to do was completely upend that formula. And the reason they did that is because they were trying to reach a different audience. That emotionalism, they decided first to take that emotionalism and give it to the hero. Because before, the emotions that would emerge in superhero comics emerged out of plot points. Something happened, somebody had an emotional reaction. What they decided to do was to pre-install emotions, pre-install anger, fear, all kinds of ready-made emotions into the mix. These are how these characters met the world. They didn't emerge slowly. And what you did was all of a sudden you had very different comics. Because the Fantastic Four, I mean, the title is almost an oxymoron. Because their powers are fantastic, but their lives are miserable. They're always fighting with each other. They are always complaining. The emotions of the superhero comics before Marvel came along were the simple, childlike emotions of the playground. Happiness, sadness, anger, fear, that's it. What happened with the advent of the Marvel Comics and the Marvel Comics superhero is that those emotions were given a powerful bath in adolescent hormones and Clearasil. All of a sudden, these emotions from the childhood playground become the emotions of the secondary school locker room. Alienation, shame, jealousy, resentment, guilt. Adolescent emotions, people feeling tortured, something, in other words, relatable. Peter Parker is a nerd who gets picked on for liking science. Not too subtle, again, not too subtle. He becomes Spider-Man out of a sense of guilt, an overriding sense of guilt. Thor is haughty, Tony Stark is vain, Doctor Strange is arrogant. Now again, that's pretty much all on the same part of the emotional spectrum. They're very similar to each other, I'll grant you, but they all have stories of being brought low. That's the idea, because this changed everything. This is the very last panel of Spider-Man's first appearance, aware that in this world, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. That is not only a way of injecting into this formula the notion of a motivation, which superheroes hadn't ever had before, because heroes did heroic things because they were heroes. They were heroes because they did heroic things. It's a circle. That's all you needed to know. This supplies motivation. And another important part of this that doesn't get much discussed, but it's central, is that by adding the fact that these heroes suffer, you take away, or at least you undercut, the notion that whiff of fascism. Because if you're a hero whose powers and abilities are protecting you from harm, what are you risking? There has to be an element of sacrifice to be a hero. And that's what Spider-Man delivers, what Marvel Comics deliver in spades. These heroes go through hell. You've got, and they also represent pure emotions. The Thing, self-pity, the Hulk, pure rage. Spider-Man, guilt, and guilt, and guilt, and guilt. He worries about the rent. He worries about girls. He worries about school. He worries about work. And if you don't look at that last panel over there, her condition is 90% emotional. Her best medicine would be knowing that her nephew is safe and well. Subtle. So here's the formula before: perfect and powerful. Now we have characters like Thor, who is haughty. You've got characters like the X-Men, who are teenage feelings of alienation given flesh and fur and scales and wings. They are, the formula used to be perfect and powerful. The Marvel inversion of that formula is very simple. They're flawed. The people around them aren't flawed, they are. Now, let's fast forward a few decades. The Distinguished Competition comes out with a movie. It does very, very well. So naturally, the next step for Marvel, who has this roster of heroes that have been wildly successful on the comic book shelf, is to follow them into the cinema space, right? It took them a while to do that. They dipped a toe, a very cautious, a very inexpensive toe, in the waters of translating from the book to the screen. I don't know how many of these showed up on American television sets. On Australian television sets. This is if you were a kid in the 1970s in the US, you got all the Marvel you wanted on your television, but it looked like that. And look at that, that's the first crossover right there. It's the Hulk and Thor right there. It's basically, we got the Avengers basically here. These were done at the top of the budget of television in the United States. Any of these, have you guys seen any of these in Australia? Okay, all right, good. Then you know whereof I speak. So they tried, the television was a little iffy, so they tried again with a movie. Now, why is the sleeve stretching? That's my question. It's one of many questions. When you talk to creators, writers of these books, artists of these books, and you ask them why now, why is this Marvel explosion happening now? Why is this superhero explosion happening now? They firmly believe that it's purely because of technology. There is a stigma to comic books, yes. As they were growing up, there was a barrier to entry. So if you surmount that barrier to entry with a movie, which can be watched by millions and millions of people, you step over that barrier. But also, a comic book page has no special effects budget. Anything can happen. And if it's drawn by Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby, anything will happen. Some crazy stuff will happen. And finally, we are now catching up. So one of the reasons for the Marvel explosion on your cinemas screens right now is timing. The time was right. It couldn't have been done before. But there's something else too. Now, this is going to take some explanation. I spend some time on this in my book, The Cape Crusade, because I think it's important to this discussion. Follow me here. There are nerds in the world, and there are normals. Now, this is less true than ever. There's a lot of crossing over of that Venn diagram now. But it's invariably true. I'm a nerd. I'm married to a normal. I know they're out there. So, what's the difference? Nerds take a look at 80 years of Marvel history, for example, with its Byzantine backstories and boatloads of characters and stories and footnotes. And to them, it's swimming in the ocean. It's exciting. The water roughs them up. They know that they're being surrounded by all kinds of life that they can't see. They know that some of it is not particularly friendly, but they don't care. They want to tread in the ocean for as long as they can because they see the fact that they will never know everything that's in it as inspiring. That's a joy to us. Normals swim laps in a hotel pool. They can see the bottom, the water is clear as cocktail ice, and they bust through their workout in half an hour and go to a meeting. Probably a sales meeting. I don't know what normals do. But how do you know if you're a nerd and a normal? I would argue that you do. But if you are asking yourself right now, am I a nerd or am I a normal? Have you ever heard yourself utter the phrase, walk me through it. Just give me the bullet points. If you have, you're a normal. This is a crucial distinction for a successful superhero movie because normals want a story. Tell me a story. Stories have beginning, middle, end. Nerds want adventures. These characters that we love from the comics iterate. They constantly churn through serialized narrative. Serialized narrative does not end. These characters go on and on and on. The Green Goblin gets away because he has to. Because what else are you going to do next month? The Green Goblin has to get away. He has to get captured. He has to get away. All these things. And also, there is a giant corporation behind it trying to prevent that everything has to get signed off by the marketing department, right? I mean, they're trying to prevent big change. Change is what makes fiction fiction. Going from the beginning through some kind of change and emerging a different person, that's a story. And if you deny a character an ending, you don't have a story, you have an adventure. So we need both. And the process of translating 80 years of history into a nice 2-hour or 2.5-hour, almost 3-hour movie means that you have to impose the action movie 3-act structure over top of this somehow. And it's daunting, and it shouldn't necessarily work. So how do you do it? How do you ensure that a product that is trying to get as many butts in seats as it can is still going to appeal to both nerds and normals? How do you build a vast universe? You do it around the edges, right? You tell a story, a nice 3-act conventional story, but you throw in Easter eggs for the nerds. Pacify the normals with a story, give the nerds something for them to get excited about. Again, another way to tell if you are a nerd or a normal. Normal, at the end of a movie, are you the one sitting in the seat saying, who's the purple guy? If you are, you're a normal. If you're the one saying, I think you'll find that's Thanos, then you are a nerd. This is an ingenious way to incorporate both of these things, to bring them both together. And it doesn't have to be a plot beat, right? It doesn't have to be a story. It can be a character moment. It doesn't matter because the normals are already in the parking lot. The normals have left. The normals are calling their babysitter and they're getting in the cars. This is for the nerds. This is for, because again, people say that we love the big fighty fight scenes. We do. We love this kind of interaction, even when they're not interacting. We love moments when they are, playing volleyball, when they're hanging around the headquarters, because these are characters to us first and foremost. They have gone from the realm of ideas to become fleshed out characters. We love that. Let's take a case in point of something. The airport fight scene from Civil War. So there's a dog whistle here for nerds because this whole scene works wonderfully as solid, straight-ahead action movie making, right? It's powerful. Something else that happens in it is it builds. Now, you might not notice it if you're not a nerd, but having these two sets of characters come at each other with their powers and having them matched in a perfect way it's like a symphony that builds. It's an orchestrated thing when two people go up against each other because their power sets are compatible in some way. To normals, it works, it's fun. Nerds see something else. Nerds see this. That moment of convergence, of having these people come at each other like this is, it's exciting. It's familiar, and well, we can talk about the toxic nature of nostalgia and how much that pervades nerd culture right now. But on the other hand, it's cool. So Now, if anybody asks me why Marvel movies work the way they do, why they have been so successful, I think it comes down to one word. Actually, several words, because the thing about a Marvel film is there are different tones, because the salient thing about the Marvel Universe is that these characters are different from each other. They have different wants, they have different motivations, they have different power sets, they have different ways of encountering the world. Remember I talked about earlier about how they come prepackaged with this set of emotions, this personality, for lack of a better word. Because again, for the longest time, superheroes were anodyne, cops in capes. You couldn't tell the difference between them unless you looked at their long johns. Then, when you looked at their costumes, you could say who is. But in terms of personality, they were exactly the same. Now, you're given, when you make a film about Thor, you are giving yourself permission to not only make it big, but to give it this epic sense of scope, this grandeur, and this gravitas, this weighty tone. When you make an Ant-Man film, you have to make a fundamentally different movie, because these characters are vastly different. They exist in the same universe, which is something that nerds really respond to, but the films can't feel that way. The films have to feel discrete, separate from one another. Imagine, just as a thought experiment, imagine making a Superman film that was as dour and gritty as a Batman film. You wouldn't do it. It wouldn't make no sense, right? It just wouldn't work. That's all I got. Let's throw it up to some questions here. But before I go, I want you to do me a favor, because there's another thing. There's timing, there's tone, and there's a third thing that makes these films work, and that is detail, attention to detail. When you go through the exhibit and you step into the throne room, the Asgardian throne room, take a look at Thor's cape. Thor's cape in the comics defies physics. It lifts up off his shoulder in a way that makes no sense. And in the exhibit and in the film, there's a little lift. It's there for me. Might not be there for you, but it is so there for me. It is a tiny detail that shows the attention. And again, it's a dog whistle. It doesn't take away from anybody else's enjoyment of this film, but it's there for me. It means that they've done their homework. And if you're a grind, if you're a nerd, if you're somebody who prizes dogged detail, then that's what you're looking for. So thank you very much. Let me open it up to any questions. I think we've got some roving mics, or yes, anybody at all.
We have one just down the front here. We'll start with the gentleman on the third row.
Hi, Glenn. How are you going?
Hey, very well, thanks.
My question is, what is your response to the Atlantic article that came out recently, which talks about Marvel's kind of publishing woes being about what's kind of sort of being business as usual and being about the big events, and there's a lot of detail in it, but also the response from the editors that diversity was kind of killing their sales?
Yeah. I did a piece on this for NPR. Basically, for those who aren't following it, for the normals among you, there was a sales meeting of where Marvel invited some of their top retailers to come in and tell them what was going on. There was about 14 people in that meeting. 2 of them mentioned the fact that books like Miss Marvel and Miss America Chavez and all these books with female protagonists or different protagonists, Black Panther, were depressing their sales. Now, those people came from the middle of the country, and there were only 2 of them. All 12 of the other people in that meeting said, no, that's ridiculous. We're finding our sales are jumping on those particular titles. Now, in a interview, he was asked what's going on with sales. He didn't want to say it's because we've been doing all these events and people are tired and fatigued. What he said was, well, we're hearing that people don't want diverse books. It's a dumb thing to say, and it's not supported by the evidence, but it also fed a feeding frenzy. I mean, I talked to Ta-Nehisi Coates about it. He said, I don't think that was necessarily fair, because are nerds fearful of the new? Are nerds, again, this goes back to the toxic nostalgia. Nerds love things the way they were when they were 12. They want the world to stay that way. And you have to have the courage of your convictions. But, I mean, America Chavez was the #1 book for a couple of weeks there. Black Panther was huge. My comic book store had to order and reorder and reorder. I think there is I've talked to several comic book store owners who actually said, we can get somebody into the store to read a Black Panther book for 3 months, because we're asking normals to do a thing that nerds do. Going into a store, picking up a comic, and having a story told to you in that manner is something you grow up with, or it's asking you to change your life in a fundamental way. Now, we can do this electronically, but it's a form of storytelling that may or may not be long for this world. I talked to several comic book shop owners who say they don't think the individual, what we call the floppies, the individual issues are going to be lasting much longer. Who can say? I think digital distribution is a huge thing, and I think trade paperbacks are going to be here for a good long while. But in terms of what Marvel needs to do to step up, I think it's a little bit of figure out what to say to the press. Don't say a dumb thing like that, and also just sticking with it, because there is a market for those books. Anything else? Yes.
Hang on, just because the audience have to hear.
Oh, they don't want to hear me. I have a theory that that can be addressed by publishers like Marvel and DC taking back the spinner racks. If individual issues were more visible in the supermarket, in the newsagent, where comics were when I was growing up, people would learn that habit to buy the issues monthly. But with the specialty stores, there's a barrier to entry. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Growing up, there were spinner racks in every grocery store where you could just pick up a Superman book or a Batman book or a Marvel book or an Avengers book, and also Archie. Archie stayed in the supermarkets. Everybody else went away. Archie is hugely successful because it is a known property. You're a mother, your kid is screaming, you can hand her an Archie comic and know what's in that, because it's the same thing that you had before. There's a different asterisk, there's a different sort of strain of Archie comics now, don't worry about that. But I'm talking about the main digests that are in the supermarkets. It's the reason that other comics left the supermarkets is because it is a very low markup product. And you had store owners complaining because kids would come in and get their grubby hands all over it and make them not saleable. So as soon as the direct market opened and direct sales through comic book stores happened, you had nerds like me hugely excited, because now it's a place for us. It's a safe space. But as I say, digital distribution is changing everything. And I don't know if you can train folks to read comics who haven't grown up with it. You can for a short time if it's a phenomenon like the Black Panther comics, but they showed me the numbers. The drop-off in numbers is at month 3. It'll happen for a while, and then it won't. Any other questions?
Hi. So when we were seeing these films first come out, it was very exciting to see superheroes come on screen. People were really excited to see new characters. Then kind of the next step was bringing those characters together and building that excitement again to see the characters all come together and be a part of a team. Do you think that's where it ends? Is there like a third step where something new will happen that will bring people back into cinemas to see some extra thing happen, or is it just individual heroes, then a team, and then is there anything more after that?
I don't know. I mean, we have films planned out through 2020. We know what's coming. We don't know what's coming after that. Robert Downey Jr. is not going to be around forever. There's another aspect to the success of the Marvel films, which I didn't touch on in this talk, but it's in the introduction in the catalog, which is casting. Casting Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark is probably the most inspired piece of casting in the history of film. But you bring these people together. That's wonderful. It allows you to play in different tones. It allows you to avoid superhero fatigue. Look, the superhero film is a genre now, and it's a way to play with other genres. So Captain America: Winter Soldier was like a 70s paranoid thriller. Captain America: The First Avenger was a war film. You can play with these modalities in interesting ways. I don't have an inside track on what's next. I would imagine, they have proven themselves, Sony at least has proven themselves very eager to do reboots at the drop of a hat. How many Spider-Man have we had? I imagine something like that is coming. Because, we're going to be getting down to Paste Pot Pete after a while. We're going to be cycling through a lot of these characters, so we're going to get Batroc the Leaper before it's all over. So I think the world only moves forward. But yeah, I don't really know what's happening next. Yeah, anybody else? I'm sorry, I can't really see.
Hi, I enjoy lots of essays and video essays on sort of potential developments, but I'm always curious how a lot of them seem to focus on how there's developments that have been present in cinema, say example, the history of the Western, and predicting how that will recapitulate in the history of or developments of superheroes, whereas I would have thought the history of the printed versions have already gone through a lot of these changes. So, for example, what you described, the change from the simple to the complex in Marvel, and other developments that have come in the 80s with the the dark and gritty and that. Do you think that those developments are those streams are going to recur, or is it an entirely room for entirely fresh developments?
Well, let's see. Tone is a thing that's cyclical. We'll forgive me, but I'll talk about Batman here for a second. So Batman goes from dark to light constantly. He becomes a lone Avenger of the Night, grim and gritty, and then he kind of leads an entire extended Bat family. The tone gets lighter until the nerds rebel and say, we don't want this anymore, and then they go back to him being a lone, grim Avenger of the Night. This has happened 3 times in his career through many different mediums, and it's going to keep going on. There are certain rhythms that you can depend on. The Marvel Universe is huge and fractious, and so much of that now has to do with not necessarily the character, but the writer. They're given a lot of leeway to play with by the editors, and they can infuse what you would call in cinema an auteurist perspective. They can make the character their own. They can futz with the tone a little bit. But there is still this idea that these characters are toys. These are heavily licensed nuggets of intellectual property. You can pull them down from their shelf, play with them for a while, but then you have to put them back. If you're a writer or a creator, you have to put it back on the shelf. So it's the same for the next person who's writing it. You can do what you want in that time and do something really innovative, but again, there's a cycle here. So what's coming next? Again, I wish I knew.
Okay, I think we've got one more question down the front here, and we might have to just wrap it there.
I wondered whether, after your book Cape Crusade, whether you'd had any blowback from the kind of not my Batman nerds that you wrote about?
Yeah, not so much, no, because that book took about a year to write, and in between the time that I started it and I finished it, something very important came out, which was the 66 Batman series on Blu-ray. For a long time. That series existed in people's minds as a memory, if they were young, when the show was on, or as a story that they told each other to kind of scare them each other and say how bad it was. It wasn't a show in their heads. It was this specter or this very fondly rendered thing. For people to be able to re-experience that took a lot of the fear of that show and the resentment of that show away. I also think, and this is happening in fandom, and this is important, the more women enter fandom, the more people of color enter fandom, the less monolithic it becomes. And things becoming less monolithic is always a good thing. Things like cosplay, things especially like fan fiction, are opening up the culture of fandom in a huge and a very important way. We used to nerds used to take this information that was written and given to creators, that were given to nerds, and we'd pore over it like Talmudic study, right? We'd pore over it and we'd say, well, actually, I think you'll find Wolverine can beat up Spider-Man because an issue like this. This is who we were. Now, the flow of information is going back and forth. With fan fiction, people are entering this dialogue, making it a dialogue. It used to be a monologue. It used to be, this is how it happens, and we all just interpret. We all sit at the bottom of the mountain and pick up the scraps. And now it is a different kind of engagement. And that is only good. That only opens things up. That only makes it more interesting, more alive, more engaged with the world. Because it was going in a direction of being this outmoded idea of American supremacy, call it what you will, of patriarchy. It was going in this very unidirectional method, and it now feels a lot more alive. The fact that there's a Captain America, the fact that there's a Captain Marvel movie coming out is the fact that there's, frankly, a Wonder Woman film coming out. That's an important step. It means that fandom is changing, and it means that the kind of fearful, toxic nostalgia, it's always going to be part of the mix, but it's one voice among many. It used to be the only voice you heard.
Fantastic. Thank you, Glenn.